Thank you so much, Wendy, and thank you all for having me here again. I've been here a couple times in the past, and it's a real pleasure to be here to speak to you about my new book, My Year of Living Spiritually from Woo-Woo to Wonderful, One Woman's Secular Search for a More Soulful Life. I know it's a mouthful. In 2017, I decided to devote myself to being more devotional, and I spent 12 months engaged in 24 different spiritual practices, which I write about in my book. And there were two books that inspired me on this project. One was A.J. Jacobs' My Year of Living Biblically. I don't know if anyone's read that book. It's a wonderful, humorous, insightful book in which he tries to follow all 700 arcane rules of the Old Testament, sometimes to hilarious effect. He ties 10% of his salary. He's fruitful and multiplies because he has twins that year. And he even carries a portable stool around with him on the New York subway system to ensure he doesn't sit in a spot where a menstruating woman has sat, which is actually one of the rules in the Old Testament. I was also inspired by Gretchen Rubin's book, The Happiness Project. I don't know if anyone's read that one, in which she devotes a year to trying to be happier. By incorporating all kinds of little habits in her life, like singing in the shower and cleaning out her closets and reading Aristotle. So those two books were kind of a guide as I set out on my year. I engaged in a whole bunch of things that could be described, variously as New Age or pagan or mystical, transcendental, even supernatural. So what did I do? Everything from goat yoga to singing in various choirs. I went on a pilgrimage to Henry David Thoreau's Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. I meditated. I tried forest therapy. I went to the Women's March in Washington in January of that year. I created a home altar with crystals and essential oils. I gave up wine for the 40 days of Lent, which was not easy. I worked with a soul coach, Kimberly Carroll, who's a member of Toronto First Unitarian, to create daily practices that would bring more intention into my life. I Marie Kondoed my home. I learned to read tarot. I embraced solitude by living in a treehouse for a few days. I even tried magic mushrooms for the first time in my life, and I can tell you it was quite the trip. And every day I wrote down things I was thankful for, and I also got a tattoo, which is up here. I could show you later if you're really curious about it. It is a bird, a swallow, like on the cover of my book. So it was a whirlwind year. And why did I do all this? Well, I partly have Donald Trump to thank. As you'll recall, that year he was elected to the White House in the beginning of 2017. And like many of you, I suspect, I despaired over what this meant for the world. I thought that maybe cultivating a deeper spiritual life might help me face the coming days with a greater sense of resolve and instead of hopeless defeat, which I think many of us were feeling at that time. But there was also another reason I embarked on this journey. I had turned 55, and midlife had sort of hit with a wallop. My kids were off to university, so I was facing the prospect of the looming empty nest. There were challenges in my 30-year marriage. I was still experiencing the pangs of alienation from my family of origin due to our religious differences. Years earlier, I had left the strict, fundamentalist Canadian Reformed Church that I was raised in, and my family had never really forgiven me. And life was shifting in other ways as well. The year before, I had attended 4 funerals and no weddings. It's funny how that starts to happen at a certain point in your life. And I realized, of course, that there were now more days behind me than ahead of me. And I wanted to make those days meaningful. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives, says the writer Anne Dillard. And like many of you, perhaps, I worried and wondered about how the last third of my life, hopefully the last third of my life, was going to unfold. In midlife, we're told to often worry more about our sagging skin than our flagging spirit. We spend a lot of money and time and energy on the exterior of our lives, how we dress, our bodies, our homes, how well our kids are doing. But how much attention do we really give to our spirit? How much do we nourish the inner sanctuary of our being? And I would argue that it's often in midlife that we become more reflective and we understand what really matters because we've experienced loss and struggle. None of us get to midlife without some of that. And we realize that we are closer to the end of our lives. It's a time when we can feel a certain restlessness or a sense of urgency about tending to our spiritual selves. The great poet Mary Oliver said, Attention is the beginning of devotion. I wanted to stop and really pay attention to my life. So I set out on this sort of eat, pray, love, kind of do-it-yourself path to enlightenment. Except unlike Elizabeth Gilbert, I didn't have tens of thousands of dollars to book a flight to Bali and meditate on a mountaintop. Instead, I experimented with spiritual practices, most of which were right in my backyard. They were doable, affordable, and accessible. And another reason I want to embark on this adventure and write about it is that I hoped it would maybe help people like me who had or were trapped in fundamentalist religions and saw no way out. As I mentioned earlier, my relationship, especially with my mother and other family members, did unravel when I was 20 and left the strict Calvinist church that I was raised in. And I'm just going to read you a little section of my book about that time in my life. Question: do you acknowledge God's covenant promises which have been signified and sealed to you in your baptism? Do you truly detest and humble yourself before God because of your sins and seek your life outside of yourself in Jesus Christ? Answer: I do. I am 19 years old, standing in front of the altar of Cornerstone Canadian Reformed Church in Hamilton and lying through my teeth. I'm participating in the ritual known as the Profession of Faith, my church's version of confirmation, the age of majority right in which young adults make public their commitment to follow in the ways of the Lord and the teachings of the church. I am making promises I know I won't keep. In front of me stands Reverend Huizinga and a bench full of somber elders, all men. Behind me is a congregation of more than 300 that includes my parents and grandparents who are looking on proudly. I am wearing a smart navy pinstripe jacket and matching modest knee-length skirt that my mother bought for me. As they beam, I die a little inside. This moment has been my destiny from the time my teenage parents, Hank and Afka, had me baptized in this church. Actually, it went further back than that, as prophesied in Jeremiah 1, verse 5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I set you apart. My indoctrination in the faith has been years in the making, and now I am expected to fulfill the promise of my birthright. My lower middle class mother and stepfather, a homemaker and carpenter, went without family vacations so that they could afford the tuition to keep me and my younger siblings at a public school, where we would have been subjected to worldly ideas like evolution and dancing. At our private Christian school, we had daily religious classes. I listened to the 10 Commandments read out in church 2,000 times over 2 decades. For 3 years, my stepfather made the long drive to our church every Wednesday night after work and waited in the parking lot while I attended a class with other teenagers, memorizing and then reciting the 129 prescribed questions and answers of the Heidelberg Catechism, the 400-year-old doctrinal tract of our faith. The cap to my religious education was a closed-door vetting by the elders to ensure I was ready to make public my profession of faith. As I stood at the front of the church to participate in this, I imagined myself as a runaway bride of Christ. I considered my escape route, down the red carpeted center aisle, past the pews of confused parishioners, including my horrified parents and grandparents, and out through the large double doors. But once I got outside, where would I go? My history was here, inside, with these people. Out there was nothing but rootlessness. The story was that my biological father had been an unhappy wanderer ever since leaving the same church and our family 2 decades earlier. I'd been told he went from city to city, woman to woman, a runaway husband, father, and son who never found his way back home again. Wouldn't the same happen to me if I followed in his footsteps? I stayed put like a dutiful bride, answering the questions set before me. Do you declare that you love the Lord God and that it is your heartfelt desire to serve him according to his word, to forsake the world and crucify your old nature? I do. My lips spoke the words, but my fingers might as well have been crossed behind my back. I knew it was wrong when I made my way to the communion table and popped a small piece of bread from the platter into my mouth. When I raised the goblet of wine to my Judas lips to wash it down, I could taste the bitterness of hypocrisy on my tongue. My hand shook as I placed the goblet back down on the white tablecloth. So I am one of those people, and there are millions of us actually, former fundamentalists, who were raised with the notion that we were born wretched sinners, never quite good enough, just the way we are. I was indoctrinated with the idea of the devil, hell, Armageddon, an end times event, which sadly it seems Donald Trump could trigger with a single tweet these days. I was not raised to have faith in the essential goodness of human nature, but was taught the concept of total depravity, which is its actual name, and that as a consequence of Eve eating the apple in the Garden of Eden, every single person is enslaved to sin. And guilt was sort of the unifying theme of my religious life, and if any of you were raised Catholics or in strict religions, you understand about this guilt. As a Jewish American comedian, Kathy Ladman says, all religions are the same, guilt but with different holidays. When I left the church of my youth, I was threatened with excommunication, and my family, because of how they were raised, believed that I was going to hell. So when I lost my faith, I essentially lost my family. After leaving the Canadian Reformed Church, I went on to have a brief flirtation with the Presbyterians, a decade-long love affair with the United Church, and I finally settled into a committed relationship with the Unitarians almost 15 years ago. But so fearful was I about my parents' reaction to me becoming a Unitarian. And at this time, we would see each other a couple of times a year. It was a very tenuous relationship, but I did not tell them that I became a Unitarian. And it was my 8-year-old daughter who innocently blurted out the news to my parents. "We're Unitarian now," she said, "and we never talk about Jesus." So you can imagine how this went over. Becoming a Unitarian is what led to a decade-long estrangement with my parents, which continued until I wrote this book. I finally did find my spiritual home among these people, you people, and I continued to be grateful for this and wanted to show in my book that with the right support, people can get out of oppressive religions and find something better. It's often painful because you might lose your connection to the very people who raised you and your familiar culture, but you stand much to gain. The right to create your own belief system, the right to a more authentic life, and the right to be part of a community that embraces you, doubts and all. Everyone's spiritual journey is unique to them, and we should all be free to discover and develop it on our own and not be coerced into belief. There are many people like me who have left religion. In fact, only 1 in 5 Canadians attends religious services anymore, and 10,000 churches are scheduled to close in this country over the next decade. About 80 million North Americans define themselves as spiritual but not religious. This is not a new idea at all. The transcendentalists of the mid-1800s were the first to consider themselves spiritual but not religious. They were led by the great philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, and they believed that spiritual truth is known intuitively rather than learned through institutions. They believed that we are born good, not sinful. They believed God was in nature rather than in the pew. And instead of relying on biblical authority, they relied on themselves. Make your own Bible, Emerson urged. I think sometimes in our culture we're somewhat suspicious of spirituality, and talking about it can make us uncomfortable. But it's certainly a conversation worth having, and I know Unitarians are very interested in this conversation. The great spiritual writer Thomas Moore says he believes the big problem of our time is loss of soul, and I think this is evident all around us in high rates of depression and loneliness, especially among women. 1 in 4 women take a psychiatric medication. About 40% of people say they're chronically lonely. I think many of us are suffering from a spiritual hunger of the soul, and I know I wanted to look for ways to satisfy that hunger. So as I approached my year of living spiritually, I combined a seeker's enthusiasm with a reporter's skepticism to the experiences that I engaged in. Some of the things I did during my year could be described as woo-woo. That's a term that's often used for people who, say, use crystals or have their chakras balanced or do Reiki or a past life regression session. And I think this is unfair, this dismissiveness that's used in conjunction with this word is somewhat unfair, and I wanted to put the word woo-woo in my subtitle of my book for a reason, because I think that it's often, sort of dismissed because it's often women who engage in these practices, and it's kind of a form of sexism to dismiss them as simply woo-woo. Billions of people believe in unbelievable to me concepts like the existence of an unproven God or a Holy Virgin Mother, and that's not considered woo-woo. So I like us to sort of reconsider, how we sometimes dismiss practices that can be very healing and helpful for people. And like I say, I think there is some sexism at play there. As I did my year, I was also very inspired by the words of Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who says, "Everything is phenomenal, everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed." Although I might not have realized it at the start of my year, I think that's exactly what I was searching for, and I think that's what a lot of us are looking for. Amazement, a rekindled feeling of wonder and a sense of meaning in a world that sometimes seems to have gone rather mad. These days it's tempting to be cynical rather than spiritual, especially when the political leadership of the free world seems intent on destroying the planet, marginalizing the oppressed, and glorifying greed. But maybe one way to fight against this inevitable disillusionment, disappointment, and despair is to cultivate a rich spiritual inner life, to tend to the inner sanctuary of our being, as the great philosopher Jean Vanier calls it. Maybe this can help us create a deeper reservoir from which to draw on when our soul feels parched. And maybe this can serve to amplify a more determined outer life so that we can find a way to be of service in the world. So did I end up a more spiritual person at the end of my year? Well, you'll have to buy my book to find out. But I will tell you this, the year did result in some changes. I pretty much eliminated television, Netflix especially, although I love Netflix. I was too hooked on it. I drink a lot less wine. I read more. Start my mornings reading because I was always falling asleep reading at night, and it's so easy in our world of social media to forget about this love of reading, so I reclaimed that. I have a gratitude practice, a very simple, short one that I do every single day. And I also, as an extrovert, I found it hard to be alone sometimes in my own company, and that's something I continue to work on, to enjoy solitude and to be by myself at times. This year also offered answers about how to live more attentively and authentically in the world. It made me consider what it means to be a good daughter, a good wife, a good mother, a good person, and it did result in some significant changes in some major relationships in my life. It meant forgiveness, not just of others, but of myself. I made peace with the past and changed the course of my future. And since my book came out, as I mentioned, I was estranged, especially from my mother, who I was very close to all my life until I left the church. And since the book has come out, I gave it to her to read before it was published because she figures very prominently in it, much more than I anticipated when I set out to write it. And although she didn't say whether she liked it or disliked it, a reconciliation has taken place, and our relationship has shifted into something much more positive, which has just been the greatest gift, because I do love my mother, and religion got in the way. But the other day, a couple weeks ago, she said to me, "I guess sometimes you just have to agree to disagree." And that was something she was never able to say before. So I feel that's some kind of miracle, actually, and it just shows it's never too late to try to fix relationships, and some things can be salvaged. The writer Polly Barron says, "Everything that happens to you is your teacher. The secret is to learn to sit at the feet of your own life and be taught by it." What I learned, I think, is that religion almost wrecked me, but spirituality saved me, and I really do feel I found my way again. Wendy mentioned this quote before, and I just love it, from Emily Dickinson: "The soul should always stand ajar, ready to welcome the ecstatic experience." I'm glad I pushed open that door, and I invite you to walk through it with me, because who knows what you might find on the other side. I did have many profound experiences during my year. I engaged in 24 different practices, and all of them except one. Past life regression just did not work on me. But I know people for whom it had, but that was the only one that didn't kind of take. Everything else had some kind of positive and sometimes very profound impact. And one of the most profound things that happened, I devoted a chapter in my book to singing. I think many of us feel that we lose our singing voice. When we're children, we sing robustly, and then something happens where we we lose our confidence, or we become self-conscious and we stop singing. And singing is just one of the most joyful things that we can do. So in my chapter called Finding My Voice, I engaged in a whole bunch of community choirs, including choir. I took a professional voice lesson and learned that I was an alto. I never knew that. And in the middle of all this, an invitation landed in I'm also a travel writer, so someone got in touch and said, we run a singcation retreat off the rugged coast of the Atlantic in Newfoundland. Would you like to come and participate in this week-long singcation and write about it? So I sang for a week with people who felt that they'd lost their voice, and we had professional direction, and then we put on a concert in a small theater in Bonavista. It was an incredible experience. One of the other things I did, and I'll finish with this reading, is Suzanne Mazars, who's the musical director at Neighborhood. I got to know her a little bit, and she has been running a comfort choir for about 10 years. It's like a deathbed choir at a large Toronto hospital. Every Friday, a group of them go out and sing to people who are in the palliative or chronic care wards, and she allowed me to join her for an afternoon. And I'm going to read a little bit about that experience, and we'll finish with that today. I have not been up close with death and suffering very often, and I am not prepared for what I see. Several of the patients in the chronic care section are unconscious, kept alive by machines attached to their windpipes. The first woman is about my age. Her eyes are closed and her mouth hangs slack. She is missing several teeth, and as we gather around her bed, I can see from the outline of her form, under the covers, that she is also missing her legs from the knees down. A car accident, I wonder? Her blue hospital gown is thin, and I can see one breast is gone. Breast cancer? So many missing pieces. But the window ledge in her room is full. There are plants in bloom, cards, and photos from another life. In one, she looks vibrant and carefree, standing on a tropical beach with what I assume is her grown son and a grandchild. There's a Mother's Day card addressed to a special mom. I naively hope for some slight movement in her face as we sing, but it doesn't come. I don't know what's happened to this woman, but I do know she is loved. As we enter the room of a patient who looks to be in her early 40s, her elderly mother is standing next to her bed. Yes, please sing, says the mother, and we launch into a short selection. The mother never stops touching her daughter, patting her shiny black hair, adjusting the cotton padding around her trach tube, lifting her hand to see if her daughter's already perfectly manicured fingernails need further trimming. When we finish our last song, the mother claps her hands and looks brightly over at her daughter, but there's no response. After, I'll learn that the daughter has been in hospital for 7 years, non-responsive for the last few. At first, I wonder why the parents have kept her artificially alive, but then I imagine that this is one of my daughters, in a silent coma for years, her heart still beating, her fingernails still growing, still needing her mother still needing her. As we head back to the volunteer room to put our vests and songbooks away, we pass a large room with a half-dozen elderly women in it, some in hospital beds, some bent over in wheelchairs. A young male orderly at one end of the room is holding an iPhone that's playing a tinny version of John Lennon's Imagine. He's singing to the woman, a few of whom follow along in quavery voices. When the orderly sees us, he invites us to sing for this group. We oblige, and some patients from the hallway also maneuver into the room. Soon there are patients all around us. Some clap their hands, some know all the lyrics, a few continue sleeping. One woman in a wheelchair raises her bent head every once in a while, looks at us, and simply moans. Some of these women are barefoot. Some have brightly painted toenails, which I take as a hopeful sign. Their legs are thin and fragile, like the limbs of schoolgirls dangling from monkey bars. More women in wheelchairs are congregating in the hallway, jockeying like bumper cars, following the call of our voices. We've practically got a concert going on here. A middle-aged woman comes into the room, goes over to the moaning woman in the wheelchair and strokes her thin gray hair and whispers gently in her ear, which quiets her momentarily. There is certainly despair here among those who are confused and feeble and dying, but there is love too. Music soothes us at the beginning of life and comforts us at the end. it achieves the miraculous task of simultaneously expressing our suffering and offering solace. Our little choir moves into the hallway because the room is getting overcrowded. As we line up against the wall, the moaning woman gestures to her daughter to move her wheelchair closer to us. As we sing, she begins to mouth the words slowly. In her confused and innocent face, I can imagine the young girl she once was, and also the old woman I'll become if I'm lucky enough to live another 30 years. All these mothers and daughters administering so tenderly to each other makes me think of my own mother and what it will be like for her at the end, whether she'll want me to stroke her hair. I think of my daughters and how I hope they'll outlive me by decades, how I hope I can hold their hands when my time comes, how I hope there will be music to mark my ending. This little light of mine, maybe even this little light of mine, the song my mother once sang to me. That would be a comfort, I believe, as my particular candle goes from a flame to a flicker and then is extinguished. If we're lucky, our lives begin with someone singing to us and end that way too. Thank you.